I have a number of Facebook friends who have been following my adventure and keeping up with my adventure, and they know about you and your mom dancing, and they know about our bachelorette crew on board and everything. So I just wanted to record this one. So one thing that's important to me, this presentation is going to seem like a little bit of a downer, but one thing that's important to me is we've spent this whole week looking at the history of slavery in the southern United States. Okay, so anyway, we've seen these big, huge mansions where the rich people lived, and we've seen the slave quarters, and we've seen, how the exploitation of one group of people led to another group of people essentially being a class unto themselves, right? What's important to me is that we don't just look at that within the context of history, because that's still absolutely going on today, right? It's also important that we don't take that out of context, because that's the way society was set up then, right? So if we can enjoy the luxury of looking back in time and seeing how they lived, then hopefully maybe there's something that we can learn from that and bring that into the present, right? Because a couple of things are unavoidable facts, right? One, slavery in Southern America between 1640 and 1863 was by far not the only example of slavery in the history of the world. The other thing too is slavery on the planet did not end January 1st, 1863. And that's the things that I hope we take home. Then the other thing too is the average person then, all they wanted to do was wake up in the morning, take care of their own, and go to bed that night knowing that they did pretty good that day, right? Mm-hmm. They didn't know that their day-to-day actions was in some way supporting slavery, but it was. If they bought sugar that was produced by slaves, or if they bought cotton clothing that was produced, the cotton was ultimately produced by slaves, right? And so the same thing is true today. All of us, we just want to wake up in the morning and go about our day and go to bed that night thinking, well, we did okay. Or at least we didn't intentionally do harm, right? Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, in our own way, we're all supporting contemporary ills that still exist in society today. So if we've learned anything by looking back at the past, I hope it's to bring some kind of awareness into how we live today. Okay? So just very quickly, I was working in my room this morning and I was going through the questions that y'all gave me last night, and the same thing kept coming up over and over. Okay? And that was slavery. Slavery, slavery. Right? Yeah. So one thing, this was the first item that I discovered that pointed me in the direction where I decided to go with this presentation. Now this is just a regular newspaper advertisement, obviously from before the war, that talks about there's a $10 reward for the return of this runaway slave, right? Obviously we all know $10 was a few hundred back then, okay? But what this tells you is that all of society was in on it, okay? It wasn't like if a slave made it to the edge of his plantation, then there were people waiting there to help them, get away. That did come along later, obviously. But what this drove home was the fact that everybody was in on Either they were profiting directly from it, or they were profiting indirectly from it, or they were tacitly supporting it. Okay? A couple of people have asked me, what if the South had won the war, or questions like this. I think the war could have been avoided altogether if the New England factory owners and the British textile mills would have simply boycotted any cotton produced by American slaves. Okay? And you'll see how that ties into where we are today. Another thing that's real important to keep in mind is that the slave trade was global, right? It was actually started by the Dutch East India Company, which was only founded in 1602, but then by the mid-1600s, they were literally the largest corporation on the planet. They were the Walmart of their day. Okay? What they did was they would go down here, they would take slaves from Africa. Now the slaves were captured by other Africans. You had the coastal Africans that would kidnap more inland Africans and then deal, they would deal, you can see here, textiles, rum, and manufactured goods that they would trade those kidnapped Africans for. Then those would get put on the slave ship and sent, the bulk of them, the arrow points to the United States, but the vast majority of the slaves either went to the Caribbean or the Spanish colonies. We got about 10% of the total slaves, imported slaves. And then of course too, the final trifecta, sugar, tobacco, and cotton made its way back to Europe, right? So that was the trade that the Dutch East India Company had going. So today when you hear activists talking about the one percenters, they were the one percenters of their time, right? And they manipulated the entire globe to their own benefit. And it wasn't just the southern plantation owners. Now, I'm not trying to justify that by any means, but I just want to make that clear. It was a global situation. Now, we look at a picture like this. This is an actual photograph of a slave that was taken before the Civil War. So this man woke up in the morning, was forced to work all day long, 365 days a year. Maybe they got an hour off on Sunday afternoons, but other than that, and we can see there's, obvious signs of physical abuse there. And this is the American slave from before the Civil War. So when we're out touring these plantations, those big houses were paid for with his labor. When we're looking at the slave shacks and those sorts of things, that's where he would have lived before the Civil War. This is a slave today. Okay? So the thing that we need to keep in mind is that slavery still exists. Now I'm going to read, and these numbers come directly from the United Nations International Labor Organization, estimates that 21 million people around the world today are engaged in forced labor. Right? Now that number of people who are enslaved today is nearly twice the number of every African that was shipped to the Western Hemisphere during the entirety of the slave trade. 240-year history of the slave trade, right? Today. The example that I always use is the chocolate industry, okay? And it doesn't matter if you buy Hershey bar or the highest grade chocolate out of the Netherlands, right? The vast majority of cocoa beans raised in the world comes from right there, Ivory Coast. Okay? They use child labor, they use slave labor, they use forced labor, anything that they can do to produce that cocoa bean so we can have chocolate. Okay? Now, one of the issues with slavery back in the day is, and the same is true, I mean, it's just a psychological norm, out of sight, out of mind. Right? So, and we're still dealing with that today. If it's happening on the other side of the world, then how could it possibly affect us, or what could I possibly do about it? Right? It's another example of slave labor today. The greatest number of slaves actually are in India. Right? It's not just Africans. And then, of course, you also have the forced sex workers. Right? Today, the illicit slave trade is a $150 billion a year industry. That's just the illicit slave trade, not including the corporations. I remember when I was a kid, maybe y'all can't remember back that long, but everything was made in America. Remember in the 70s? The look for the union label, right? Because you wanted to know that the clothes on your back were made by Americans who were paid well, who could feed their families, and we were all in this together. Okay? Then what happens? Nixon goes to China. Then what happened right after that? General Electric says, you know what? I think we're going to build a factory in China. And that opened up the floodgates. Now you can't go into any dollar store anywhere and find a single thing that was made in America. Television invented in America. Not one single television today is made in America. Even in my profession, the skyscraper, okay? Up until the 70s, every single skyscraper in the top 10 of the world was in America. And now we don't have a single one. Right? I think the new Freedom Tower may be like 11th or 12th. Okay? So, when we think about the past, the reason why the past is so important to me is because if you look at it and you consider the overall timeline, where we've been, how we've gotten, where we are now, what's the only natural thing? You're going to automatically understand where we're going. And if you don't do that, you won't understand where we're going. Okay? Now, I have zero desire for y'all to be left with a negative Debbie Downer impression of me, so I only have 2 more slides. This one is fairly important. Now, keep in mind, I spent today working on this, so this is all as fresh to me as it is to y'all. This blew me away. Half of the countries on the planet do not have any legal provisions on the books outlawing slavery. See, the countries in orange, provisions exist. The countries in purple, no provisions exist. Right? Now, obviously, moral conviction, especially like, say, for instance, in Canada, would dictate that there's very likely little slavery. In America, even though we have laws against slavery, what will happen is these traffickers, either from South America or China or what have you, they'll say, hey, for $40,000, I can get you to America. Or $20,000, I can get you to America. Oh, what do you don't have that kind of money? No problem. Work it off when you get there. It's like a modern form of, you remember when we talked about indentured servitude? Except the servitude never ends. You know? Or when it does, they'll say, well, don't you want your mom to come to America? Aren't you willing to work for her to come to America? And a lot of them don't even make it. Right? So now, as I promised, I'm not going to end on a low note. because there's no reason to complain about something if you can't do anything about it. What I would like for y'all to consider doing, there's a website, freetheslaves.net. Okay? If you will consider just reviewing that, going to that website, perusing the website, this is where I learned a lot about what I was telling y'all about. It also has options that can educate, that you can use to help educate yourselves and anyone else you love about how not to support contemporary slavery. Then, of course, too, obviously, you know, there's donations. But again, I don't mean to be a downer. It's just, I can't go to these big, huge plantations and think about, you know, what really happened. Okay? And another thing that's going on politically in the world today, or at least in America today, is this, it's called cancel culture, right? Mm-hmm. Right up here, even in Baton Rouge, where they have all the flags that fly that of the governments that used to control this soil over time. They have Spain, and they have France, and they have England, they have the United States. They took down the Confederate flag. And I'm not talking about the Confederate battle flag that everyone's, you know, that's been tarnished to be a symbol of hate. They just don't have any Confederate flag. So they're trying to pretend as if that section of our history never existed, right? Mm-hmm. Now, there may be some validity to that mindset. I mean, surely we can grow beyond honoring the Confederacy. But the only honorable way to right the wrongs of our past is to right the wrongs of our present. And that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.